The day I moved into the cabin at the edge of the lake, Celeste Whitmore, president of the Homeowners Association, marched her board across my porch and ordered me off her land. The morning had smelled like pine sap and fresh-cut grass when I arrived, the kind of quiet that made a man believe a place might finally let him rest. That quiet lasted less than 3 hours. She looked at my old pickup truck, at my mud-caked boots, and called me a drifter taking advantage of an expensive neighborhood. Her voice carried the practiced confidence of someone used to being obeyed the moment she raised it. I did not argue with her. I only asked whether she remembered the payment she signed every single month for 7 years. She laughed in my face, a short, dismissive sound meant to end the conversation before it started, right up until I opened my leather case and set the lease agreement, carrying her own signature, on the table between us. For a moment the porch went completely silent, the kind of silence that tells a man he has finally been heard. I had been in the cabin less than 3 hours when the golf carts came rolling up the gravel path, 4 board members trailing behind Celeste like she was leading a parade. I was on a ladder, prying loose a rotted board on the front eave when she stepped out of her cart without so much as a greeting and demanded to see my permit from the association. I told her, calmly, that the cabin did not belong to the association at all. She laughed, right there in front of the others, the kind of laugh meant to embarrass a man in front of an audience. She looked me over, the flannel shirt, the work gloves, the truck with rust creeping along the wheel wells, and decided on the spot that I must be a caretaker, or worse, someone squatting where I had no right to be. She called this stretch of shoreline the community's lakefront and told me the association had managed it for decades. I asked if she had brought a deed, a title, anything with her name or the association's name attached to this parcel. She had nothing but a clipboard full of complaint forms and the confident posture of a woman who had never once been questioned in front of her own board. She told me to be gone by the end of the day regardless, and warned that if I refused, she would call the sheriff, have my truck towed, and see the cabin padlocked before nightfall. One of the board members, a thin man who kept glancing at his shoes, seemed to want to say something but stayed quiet under her shadow. Standing there, listening to a woman, threatened to seize a piece of land her own signature had acknowledged for years. I understood something she did not yet grasp, that she had no idea I was the very man behind the company that had been collecting her rent check every month since long before she ever became president. I said nothing about that. I only reached over and switched on the small camera bolted under the porch eave, the one my father had installed years earlier for security, and let it record everything that followed. Before she climbed back into her cart, Celeste turned and delivered the line I would remember for a long time afterward, telling me that men like me always thought putting up a tent meant they could call a place home, and that in Silver Pine Ridge, she decided who got to stay. As the carts rolled away down the gravel path, I stood on the porch and watched the dust settle, thinking about how little that woman knew about the ground beneath her own tires. I want to explain why I was standing on that porch in the first place, because the reason matters more than anything Celeste said that afternoon. My grandfather, Walter Rourke, built that cabin with his own hands more than 50 years earlier, on 6 acres that had always belonged to our family alone, separate from everything around it. I remembered visiting as a boy, the smell of cedar shavings on the floor, my grandfather's voice telling me this ground would outlast every fence anyone ever tried to build around it. After my father passed away that winter, I made the decision to leave the city, restore the cabin, and take direct control of the land my family had held onto for 3 generations. It was not an easy decision, but sitting in an office reviewing spreadsheets never felt like the life my father had actually wanted for either of us. The entire neighborhood of Silver Pine Ridge, every paved road, every manicured lawn, every fence line had been carved decades earlier out of what used to be the Rourke family farm. 30 years before I arrived, my father sold off individual lots for homes, but he kept ownership of the internal roads, the entrance gate, the clubhouse, the northern shoreline, the drainage systems, and the green belts surrounding the development. The association never owned any of that ground. Instead, they signed a long-term lease with Rourke Land Holdings, the company my father built and I eventually inherited, and that lease required monthly rent along with strict adherence to boundaries the association was granted permission to use. The cabin itself was written into every version of that lease as excluded property, land the association had no authority over whatsoever. Because payments had passed through a law firm for 7 years while I worked elsewhere, Celeste knew our company by name only. She had never once met the man behind it, never had reason to picture him as anything other than a distant signature on a monthly transfer. Walking the property that first week, I noticed the old family sign that used to mark the entrance to our 6 acres had been pulled down, and the access road leading to my cabin now carried a freshly painted board reading Silver Pine Community Grounds. That told me Celeste had not simply misunderstood the situation. She may have deliberately worked to convert private land into association property on paper long before I ever moved in. A neighbor named Laurel Keene stopped by that same week to introduce herself, carrying a jar of homemade preserves as a welcome gift, and quietly warned me that Celeste had already been telling residents about her plans to convert the cabin into what she called a lakefront hospitality center. Hearing that, I understood my arrival had interrupted something already in motion, something Celeste had been building toward long before she ever laid eyes on me. Laurel also mentioned that Celeste had once tried to convince the previous board to declare the cabin a safety hazard, hoping the county would condemn it without anyone ever needing to prove ownership at all. A plan that apparently fell apart, only because a county inspector found the structure perfectly sound. The following morning I found 3 violation notices taped to my door before I had even finished my coffee. One claimed my truck failed the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Another claimed the cabin's wood stain had never received association approval. A third claimed my construction tools created an unsightly nuisance. Together they totaled $1,850 in fines, levied against a property the association had no jurisdiction over. I read each notice twice, half amused and half genuinely curious how far this woman intended to push a claim built on nothing. I sent Celeste an email asking her to point to the specific clause granting the association authority over my land. Her response arrived within the hour, brief and cold, referring to me only as an unverified resident. She demanded I submit employment records, financial statements, and a background check before she would even consider addressing my concerns. I declined and reminded her again that the association held no authority here. She showed up a second time that week, this time with a private security guard trailing behind her, and in front of Laurel and a handful of curious neighbors, she mocked me openly. She said a man like me could never afford lakefront property on his own. She suggested my paperwork had probably been purchased somewhere online. She called the cabin a pile of rotting wood occupied by an unemployed man playing pretend, and a couple of the neighbors laughed along with her, unwilling to risk her attention landing on them instead. I stayed calm through all of it and simply asked her what she knew about a company called Rourke Land Holdings. She waved the question away, calling it some nameless landlord entity, then bragged that she personally had kept that landlord's rent artificially low for years through sheer negotiating skill. She had no idea she was boasting about her own dealings directly to the man she was boasting about, and there was a strange kind of satisfaction in letting her keep talking. I asked whether she had ever actually read the final page of that lease agreement. She told me the association president did not need to read every small detail, that she had people for that. That single sentence would become important evidence of her negligence later, though she could not have known it in that moment. After she left, I called my attorney, a sharp and precise woman named Mara Klein, and asked her to send me every lease document, every payment record, and every piece of correspondence exchanged with the association over the years. Mara had handled our family's affairs long enough to know when I was being patient for a reason, and she promised the boxes would arrive within the week. That night I sat on the porch steps and thought about my father, about the way he used to say that land never lies even when the people standing on it do. He had spent decades quietly building something durable, never once needing to announce his authority the way Celeste seemed to need it every single day. I wondered what he would have made of a woman marching onto our family's cabin and ordering his son off of it, and I suspected he would have found the whole situation almost funny, the kind of irony that only revealed itself with patience. I did not feel angry so much as curious, wanting to understand exactly how far Celeste had let her ambition carry her before I decided what to do about it. 3 boxes of files arrived at the cabin within days, more than a decade of paperwork carefully preserved by Mara's office. I spent 2 full nights going through every renewal, every receipt, every boundary acknowledgement, spreading pages across the kitchen table until the lamplight barely reached the corners of the room. What I found confirmed everything I suspected and more. Celeste had personally signed a certification recognizing Rourke Land Holdings as the rightful owner of the surrounding grounds. She had signed an addendum explicitly stating the cabin fell outside association control. She had signed a promise never to develop or commercially exploit the lakefront acreage under any circumstance. Over 7 years, she authorized more than 80 separate checks or transfers to my company, yet on every financial report she distributed to residents, she never once labeled those payments as rent. Instead, she recorded them under a category she invented herself, calling it lake conservation and infrastructure fees. That single decision convinced most of the neighborhood that the association owned the common grounds outright, when in truth they were only tenants paying to use land that belonged entirely to my family. I sat with that realization for a long while, understanding that an entire community had been quietly misled about the ground beneath their own homes. Buried deeper in the files, I found letters Celeste had written to Mara years earlier, asking to purchase the land outright for a price far below its actual market value. When my father's estate declined, Celeste had written back that the association would find another way to gain control of the property. At the time, nobody thought much of that sentence. Reading it now, with everything else laid out in front of me, I began to suspect the campaign to seize my cabin was not a misunderstanding at all, but a calculated step toward pressuring a landowner into selling. I called an old colleague, a surveyor named Owen Sutter, and asked him to walk the boundary lines with fresh equipment. He arrived 2 days later with stakes and a transit, moving methodically along the tree line while I trailed behind with a clipboard. What he found only sharpened my suspicion. The association had quietly expanded onto my property in 3 separate places, extending their parking area, constructing an observation platform, and laying irrigation piping across land that was never theirs to touch. Owen shook his head and told me he had seen plenty of boundary disputes over the years, but rarely one this deliberate. I had more than enough grounds to file suit immediately, but I wanted to see how far Celeste intended to take this before I acted. I asked Mara to hold off sending any formal warning letter. My goal was simple. I wanted Celeste to stand in front of her own board and declare false ownership out loud, on the record, before anyone stepped in to stop her. Owen packed up his equipment that afternoon and asked me, half joking, whether I planned to let the association keep pretending the shoreline belonged to them. I told him patience had a way of building a stronger case than anger ever could, and that I intended to let Celeste keep talking until she ran out of rope. He laughed and said he had never met a landowner quite so willing to let someone trespass a little longer, just to see how the story ended. In truth, part of me wanted to understand exactly why a woman with everything to lose would risk so much over a piece of shoreline she never legally controlled in the first place, and I suspected the answer had far less to do with community pride than she wanted anyone to believe. I left the cabin for a few hours one afternoon to visit the county records office and confirm a detail in the original survey. When I returned, I found the padlock on my gate had been cut clean through, the severed shackle still hanging from the chain like something out of a break-in report. An association truck sat parked in my yard as though it belonged there. 2 workers were measuring my living room while Celeste stood in the middle of my cabin, directing them on where to install a reception counter. She announced, without a hint of hesitation, that the association had reclaimed what she called an abandoned community structure. I told everyone to leave my home immediately. She replied that men like me tended to raise their voices loudest right when they realized they had no real authority to back them up. She thrust a printed resolution into my hands, one she claimed made the cabin official community property. I looked it over carefully and noticed it lacked the signatures of the full board, lacked any parcel number, had never been filed with the county, and had been drafted only 2 days before I ever moved in. The paper felt flimsy in my hands, hastily assembled, the kind of document meant to intimidate rather than hold up under any real scrutiny. Laurel arrived moments later and quietly began recording the entire confrontation on her phone, standing just close enough to catch every word without drawing attention to herself. I called the sheriff's department, not to demand an arrest, but simply to have a trespassing incident placed on record. Deputy Miles Corbett arrived within 20 minutes, reviewed the paperwork on the spot, and asked the association crew to leave the property at once. Celeste pushed back, insisting local law enforcement simply did not understand community governance, her voice rising in a way I had not heard from her before. Before she climbed into her truck, she turned to me and promised that at Friday's association meeting, she would prove, in front of everyone, that I was nothing more than a con man. I told her I would be there, and even suggested she bring the association's attorney along for good measure. She mistook my calm agreement for fear and announced the meeting would be opened to every resident in the neighborhood. After they finally drove off, I noticed a folder Celeste had left behind on my kitchen counter in the chaos, forgotten in her rush to save face in front of Deputy Corbett. Inside were architectural renderings for a lakefront resort designed by a developer named Grant Halpern. The main lobby in those drawings sat exactly where my cabin currently stood, drawn in careful detail down to the placement of the windows facing the water. In that moment, I understood Celeste was not acting out of some misplaced sense of community duty. She needed me gone to finalize a deal she had been building quietly behind everyone's back, and I had very nearly walked away without ever finding the proof of it. In the days leading up to the meeting, Celeste sent an email to the entire neighborhood accusing me of forging documents, threatening association staff, occupying community property, and driving down home values across the development. She attached photographs of my truck and the half-finished cabin exterior, framing me as some dangerous transient who had wandered into a respectable community. A number of residents began eyeing me with open suspicion whenever I walked through town for groceries, and one woman even crossed the street rather than pass me on the sidewalk. Celeste even arranged for a tow truck to come haul my vehicle away, claiming it had been illegally parked on association grounds. I showed the driver the parcel map for my own land, and he refused the job outright once he understood the situation. Celeste called him directly, pressuring him to follow through anyway, unaware the entire call was being recorded on his dispatch line, a detail that would later prove useful. Laurel told me later that she had overheard two women outside her shop debating whether I was dangerous. One of them insisting she had seen my truck idling near the school in the mornings, which was not even true since I had no reason to drive anywhere near the school at all. It struck me how quickly a reputation could be manufactured out of nothing more than a few carefully chosen photographs and a confident tone of voice. Laurel, for her part, refused to repeat any of it, telling anyone who asked that she had actually spoken with me and found nothing threatening about a man restoring his own family's cabin. Around that same time, Warren Dobbins, the association's treasurer, quietly asked to meet me at the diner in town, choosing a corner booth away from the front windows. He admitted the association still sent $18,500 every single month to Rourke Land Holdings, though he had always assumed the company belonged to some elderly investor living somewhere back east. I did not confirm my ownership right away. Instead, I asked him why that payment had been hidden from residents for so long. Warren explained that Celeste personally controlled every financial report and never allowed the full board to review the complete lease documents, only carefully selected summaries she prepared herself. She had once told him that if residents ever learned the association did not actually own the common grounds, they would lose all confidence in the leadership. Warren also mentioned Celeste was currently pushing the board to approve a project she called a Lake Improvement Initiative, with a price tag near $2 million. In truth, that money was meant to prepare the shoreline for Grant Halpern's development. Warren's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, the look of a man who had spent years staying quiet and finally decided the silence had cost him enough. I asked Warren to bring the original financial ledger to the meeting on Friday. I told him plainly that I had no intention of punishing innocent families for one woman's scheme, only stopping her from abusing a position she had clearly outgrown her responsibility to hold. He nodded and said he would rather lose his seat on the board than keep signing off on numbers he no longer trusted, and he asked if I would be willing to let him speak first at the meeting so the rest of the board could hear it from someone they had known for years rather than a stranger who had just moved in. That night, I opened my father's old safe and removed the original signed lease, complete with the county seal, Celeste's own signature, and a termination clause, allowing me to cancel the entire agreement if the association ever committed fraud or trespassed onto excluded property. I read through it one more time by lamplight, the paper soft with age, and thought about how strange it was that a document my father filed away so quietly would end up deciding so much. The clubhouse was packed by the time Friday evening arrived, every folding chair filled, and a handful of residents standing along the back wall. Celeste sat at the center of a small stage, flanked by the association's attorney and Grant Halpern, who had been introduced to the room as a community development consultant. She had arranged for me to stand at the back of the room, positioned like a defendant awaiting judgment rather than a guest invited to speak. She projected photographs of my truck, my tools scattered across the yard, and the cabin mid-repair onto the screen behind her, each image chosen to make me look as small and disreputable as possible. She called me a trespasser, a resident who had never paid a cent in association dues, and a man who believed stubbornness could somehow substitute for legitimate ownership. She declared the association had cared for that land for 30 years, and therefore had every right to claim it. Even the association's own attorney looked visibly uncomfortable hearing an argument with absolutely no legal foundation behind it, shifting in his seat and avoiding eye contact with the crowd. I asked Celeste to answer 3 simple questions in front of everyone. Did the association hold a certificate of ownership for the cabin? Did she know the parcel number for the land she claimed to control? Did she know exactly where the $18,500 sent out every month actually went? The room went quiet enough that I could hear the ceiling fans turning overhead. She dodged the first two questions entirely, but proudly claimed she personally approved that third payment herself, describing it only as a service fee to an unrelated company. I removed a canceled check bearing her own signature and read the payee line aloud for the entire room to hear. Rourke Land Holdings, LLC. She laughed it off, insisting I must simply share a surname with the company by coincidence, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. I set down formal business registration records proving I was the sole owner. A murmur swept through the crowd, chairs creaking as people leaned toward one another to whisper. Celeste pivoted immediately, accusing me of recently buying the company solely to extort the association. That was when Mara walked through the door and presented ownership transfer documents dated 7 years earlier, along with proof that Celeste herself had received and personally signed for the notice confirming my ownership at that time. I placed the original lease on the table and pointed directly to her signature on the addendum concerning the cabin. I told her calmly that she did not simply misunderstand that the association was leasing this land. She had personally signed her own name confirming the cabin never belonged to her authority in the first place. For the first time all evening, Celeste had no immediate answer ready, and the silence stretched long enough that even her allies on the board began exchanging uneasy glances. Warren stepped forward and set the financial ledger down beside it, telling the room he wanted every board member to see exactly what payments Celeste had been quietly hiding from them for years. A woman near the front, someone I recognized from the mailboxes down by the entrance gate, stood up and asked Celeste directly why the dues she paid every quarter had never once been explained in plain language. Celeste opened her mouth to answer, and then closed it again, unable to find a version of the truth that did not implicate her further. Another resident asked whether the association's insurance even covered land it did not actually own, a question that sent the board's attorney reaching nervously for his notepad. I stayed quiet through most of it, letting the room work through its own confusion rather than pushing harder than I needed to. Sometimes the most convincing case is the one that lets other people ask the questions themselves, and by the time the meeting reached its second hour, it was the residents themselves, not Mara or myself, who were doing most of the pressing. Celeste tried to regain her footing by insisting the financial questions had nothing to do with her authority as association president. I set down a second folder, this one containing the architectural drawings I had found left behind in my own kitchen. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his chair and denied any formal agreement existed between them, though the denial came a beat too late to sound convincing. Mara then projected a series of emails exchanged between Grant and Celeste, in which she promised to clear what she called the obstacle at the cabin before finalizing any development contract. According to those messages, her plan involved using an association resolution to seize the cabin, declaring the land abandoned, pressuring Rourke Land Holdings into a forced low sale, and ultimately securing herself an executive position within the resort project once she left the association behind. The emails had been forwarded automatically to my legal team because Celeste had unknowingly used a work address still linked to old lease correspondence on file, a small technical oversight that would end up costing her everything. Warren flipped open the ledger and pointed to a transfer of $240,000, moved from the reserve fund into a consulting firm connected to Grant. The association attorney immediately stated on the record that he had never been informed of that transaction, and I watched him quietly slide his chair a few inches further from Celeste. Several residents turned toward her, demanding an explanation, their voices rising over one another until the room felt more like a courtroom than a community meeting. Rather than offering one, she pivoted straight back to attacking me, insisting a man living alone in a cabin had no business controlling the future of an entire neighborhood. claiming I had merely inherited what I possessed and never truly earned it, and insisting she had built this community with her own hands while I only showed up to collect a check. I let her finish before I answered. I told her that ownership did not simply disappear because she looked down on the way a man dressed or the truck he chose to drive, and that inheritance did not make a claim any less legitimate than the one she had spent years fabricating. I laid out a formal notice of lease violation covering unauthorized entry into the cabin, boundary encroachment, concealment of a private commercial agreement, and misuse of leased property. Under the terms of the original lease, the association had 30 days to correct these violations, or lose access entirely to the clubhouse, the entrance gate, and the lakefront grounds. A ripple of alarm passed through the room as residents began to understand what that would actually mean for their daily lives. I made clear I had no interest in punishing the families who called this neighborhood home. I simply would not continue any agreement while Celeste remained in control of it. For the first time, she seemed to understand that her entire position of power rested on land belonging to the very man she had spent weeks calling a drifter. And something in her posture finally began to crack. Following that meeting, the board voted to suspend Celeste from her position, though she refused to accept the outcome, calling the vote invalid and locking the association office the very next morning before anyone could review the files inside. By the following day, I received formal notice that the association had filed a court petition attempting to establish legal ownership over the cabin. Celeste produced an old community map showing a cabin shaded in as shared property, presenting it to the court as though it settled the matter entirely. Owen examined the document and quickly identified several inconsistencies: an incorrect typeface for the period, boundary lines that had clearly been shifted, and a filing number that actually belonged to a completely different parcel elsewhere in the county. A records clerk named Judith Shaw located the genuine original map buried in the archive, unfolding it carefully across a long wooden table while I watched, and it confirmed without question that the cabin had always belonged solely to the Rourke family. I also discovered that Celeste had signed the name of a former board member, a man who had passed away years earlier, onto her newest resolution, a detail that turned what had been a property dispute into something closer to outright fraud. Without any need for physical confrontation, the tension continued building through the sheer weight of what stood to be lost. The association facing the loss of every shared facility, residents facing steep legal costs, and the shoreline itself facing potential destruction under a resort development none of them had approved or even known about until now. Celeste attempted one final private meeting with me at the cabin, arriving alone this time, without her board or her security guard trailing behind her. She offered to cancel every outstanding fine if I simply agreed to sell the land outright. When I declined, her tone shifted into something colder, and she asked what a man like me could possibly do with a place like this, besides sit on the porch and watch the timber rot away. I told her I at least understood the difference between caring for land and stealing it out from under someone. She did not have a response for that, only a long, tight-lipped silence before she turned back toward her car. The porch camera captured every word of that offer, along with the quiet admission buried inside it. I sent the recording straight to Mara to be entered into the court record, knowing it would matter far more than either of us realized in that moment. That evening, sitting alone on the porch, after Celeste's car had disappeared down the gravel road, I found myself thinking less about winning and more about how a person convinces themselves that taking something is the same as earning it. She had spent years signing documents she never read, collecting authority she never questioned, and somewhere along the way had genuinely started to believe the land answered to her, rather than to the paper trail sitting quietly in my father's old safe. At the emergency hearing, Celeste still appeared claiming the title of association president, insisting she was the one protecting this community from a greedy landowner. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and quiet, with only a handful of residents seated in the gallery behind us. I never once asked for higher rent or for any family to be removed from their home, and I made a point of saying so clearly when it was my turn to speak. I asked only for an injunction preventing the association from entering the cabin again, the cancellation of every fraudulent fine, restoration of the boundary lines they had encroached upon, an independent audit of the association's finances, and a permanent block on Celeste signing any future development agreement. Mara presented the evidence one piece at a time, methodical and unhurried: the original lease, Celeste's own signature, 7 years of payment records, the authentic county map, security footage of the break-in, the email exchange with Grant, and the recorded offer to buy my silence. Each piece landed heavier than the last, and I watched Celeste's expression shift from defiance to something closer to resignation as the pile of documents grew. The association's attorney formally withdrew from representing Celeste personally, citing an obvious conflict of interest, and by that point she had no one left standing beside her at the table. Judge Rebecca Alden confirmed on the record that the association had only ever held leasehold rights, never ownership, over the disputed grounds, her tone measured but unmistakably final. The court issued a temporary injunction and ordered the association to hold a new emergency election under independent oversight. Celeste was removed from her position by an overwhelming vote a week later. Grant withdrew from the resort project entirely once he learned those emails would be forwarded to financial investigators, and he was never seen in Silver Pine Ridge again. Outside the courthouse, a light rain had started to fall, and I remember standing under the awning with Mara while she gathered her files, both of us quiet for a moment after weeks of preparation finally reached their conclusion. She told me cases like this rarely ended so cleanly, and that most people underestimated how much a well-organized folder of paperwork could accomplish against someone who relied entirely on bluster. I thanked her for believing the situation was worth this much careful attention from the very first phone call, and she reminded me that most landowners never bother keeping their paperwork in order well enough to prove anything at all, which was the only real reason any of this had worked in my favor. As she left the courtroom, Celeste turned back one last time and claimed I had destroyed this community. I told her that she was the one who had built an entire community on top of land she never once owned, and that all I had done was show everyone the receipt. Once Celeste had been removed, Warren and the newly formed interim board approached me to negotiate, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table this time, instead of dictating terms from a stage. I had every legal right to declare the lease void and raise the rent substantially, but I chose not to take that path. Instead, I offered an amended agreement, one that held rent steady for 3 full years, required full financial transparency with every resident, prohibited the association from ever again expanding onto private land, established an independent committee to oversee finances going forward, and permanently protected the lakefront from any future commercial development. In exchange, the association agreed to remove every sign falsely declaring the cabin community property, restore the land they had encroached upon, cover the legal costs from the dispute, and send a formal written apology to be read aloud at the next general meeting. Celeste herself came under investigation for misuse of association funds and falsifying official records. I never needed to describe exactly what punishment awaited her, only that she lost her position, lost the respect of nearly everyone in that neighborhood, and now had to face the legal consequences of her own choices, one hearing at a time. Word around town was that she moved out of Silver Pine Ridge entirely by the end of that year, unable to walk into the grocery store without someone recognizing her name from the emergency meeting, everyone still talked about. Laurel came by one weekend to help me plant a new row of trees along the property line, the two of us working in comfortable silence, broken only by the sound of shovels turning soil. Slowly, residents who had once believed Celeste's stories about a greedy outside landlord began to understand who I actually was, and more than a few stopped by the cabin over the following months just to introduce themselves properly. Warren became something of a regular visitor himself, dropping off quarterly financial statements without being asked, determined never again to be the kind of treasurer who signed things he had not read. I hung my grandfather's original wooden sign back over the cabin door, the one reading Rourke Cabin, private land since 1972, and stood back for a long moment admiring how right it looked against the freshly stained wood. In one of the final quiet afternoons of that whole ordeal, I sat on the porch as a new rent envelope arrived in the mail. This time the memo line no longer read Lake Conservation Fee. It read simply, Land Rent, paid to owner Evan Rourke. I set the envelope down on the small table beside my chair and let the late afternoon light settle over the water, thinking about how much had changed since the morning Celeste first climbed out of that golf cart and told me to leave. Celeste had spent years building the image of the most powerful woman in Silver Pine Ridge, yet she never understood one simple truth the whole time. Her chair at the head of every meeting, the clubhouse she loved to stand inside, and even the very road she once used to come and order me off my own land, all of it had been sitting on ground that belonged to me the entire time. She mistook a quiet man in a work shirt for someone without power, when the truth was that power had never needed to raise its voice in the first place. I still keep that padlock, the one she cut through, hanging on a nail inside the tool shed, not out of bitterness but as a reminder of how easily people mistake a calm exterior for an absence of strength. Some evenings, when the lake goes still, and the light turns that soft copper color my grandfather always loved, I think about how close I came to simply walking away that first afternoon rather than reaching for the leather case still packed in my truck. It would have been easier in some ways to let Celeste believe whatever story let her sleep at night. But my father built something here worth defending, quietly and patiently. Over decades, most people never bothered to notice, and I decided a long time ago that quiet was never the same thing as weak.